Thank you, Humia, for inviting me to this very exciting workshop. My talk is a little bit different from the previous talks, which focuses more on their very much on their body. But then we are working more on the brain mechanism. And then in this talk, I'd like to share my thought about the roles of embodiment in the cognitive development of robotics. The research aim of our study is to understand the underlying mechanism of the cognitive development. To address this issue, we take mainly the two approaches. One side that we are, sorry, the freezing. Yeah, one side we are directly analyzing the behaviors of children and try to understand the when and what abilities that they acquire through the developmental stages. And on the other side, we also designed the computational model for robots to acquire the childlike behaviors. We designed the computational neural network model inspired the human brain and then examine what neural mechanism allows the robots to acquire the cognitive behavior like children's. And we hope that by integrating these two approaches, we can better understand the underlying neural mechanism for the child development, especially how the developmental stages, the long-term development can be achieved by the neural network modeling, and also the diversity in development is explained as also the modification in the neural network mechanism. And as a plausible hypothesis to explain the underlying neural mechanism, we have been focusing on the theory called predictive coding. Since yesterday, we have been discussing a lot about the predictive coding and the free energy principle. And Professor Carl Friston gave a beautiful talk about the principle, the free energy principle. Here, just a short recap. The ideas of the predictive coding is that our human brain works as a predictive machine, which means that the brain tries to minimize the prediction error to perceive the world and act on the environment. And here I illustrate the ideas of how the brain utilizes the prediction from the internal model to perceive the world, which is so-called perceptual inference, and also the act on the environment to minimize the prediction error. And the additional important idea here is the Bayesian brain ideas. It is suggested that when we integrate the predictions and the incoming sensory signal, that we utilize the Bayes theorem to to integrate the sensory input indicated as a red Gaussian distribution here, and the top-down predictions indicated by the yellow Gaussian distribution. And the important point is that the precision of the sensory signal and the prior predictions determine how strongly our perception or posteriors relies on each signal. And the neuroscientist there has also suggested that the diversity in the development can be explained as a modification in this predictive processing. One idea is about the autism spectrum disorder, which is one type of the neurodevelopmental disorders, been suggested as aberrant precisions in the prior predictions. One hypothesis says that the persons with autism spectrum disorders have the weak prior knowledge, which has the larger variances in this Bayesian theorem. That's why the persons with ASD often have the hypersensory sensitivities. So inspired by this hypothesis, we have been investigating whether the child behavior can be explained by this predictive processing, and also whether we can design the neural network model to replicate the child behaviors. In the child experiment, we utilized the drawing experiment, just one example. Here we provided only a part of the picture, like, for example, the contours of the face or only the inner feature of the face, and then asked children to draw whatever they like. The ideas of the drawing experiment is that we can test their abilities of perceptual and active inference. In order to complete the missing parts in this figure, the children first have to fulfill the missing parts by utilizing their own predictions. And then the drawing, the behaviors can be achieved as an active inference. So by utilizing this experiment, we could nicely test how their children acquire the perception and active inference, and also whether their individual differences can be also observed in this drawing behaviors. On the right side, you can see the several examples of the children's drawing. The younger children often show the scribbling behaviors or coloring behaviors, whereas the older children gradually acquire the completion ability. And then in order to explain what neural mechanism would produce this developmental change of drawing behavior, we designed a computational neural network model to train the robot to explain their children's behaviors. Here we utilize their simple recurrent neural network model to learn to produce the trajectories. The important idea here is that this network can predict not only the mean of their signal, but also the variance of the signal, how precise that signal is. And then the variance of the signal can be utilized to be integrated with the incoming sensory signal by following the Bayesian inference idea. And inspired by the hyperplier hypothesis about autism spectrum disorder, we decided to modulate the parameter here to change the variance or the precision of their predicted signal. And what we found is that when we provide the kind of typical parameter, the h equal 1, the network succeeded in producing the completion behaviors. Whereas the network had a very strong prior prediction, the network tended to produce the fixed patterns. For example, in this case, this network produced the face, although the intended pattern was curved. Or in case the network had very weak prior predictions, the network failed in achieving or learning the desired task. So with this, the parameter modification, we could observe how the different individual differences in the drawing behaviors can be reproduced by the neural network model. Here I summarize the two studies, the result, that by modulating their prior prediction, we could generate their typical developmental completion behavior, which is often observed in the older children. And then when we had a hypoplier, the network often produced a scribbling behavior, which was observed in younger children. And on the left side, you can see that the different types of the immaturity in the drawing behavior, which is, for example, there are very stereotypic behaviors, always drawing the patterns regardless of the input signal. This result looked nice because we could replicate the children's behaviors, the developmental change, and also the individual diversity by modulating the network model. Maybe you now recognize that where at the embodiment. I have to admit that our current study do not take their embodiment into account so much, but I believe that embodiment plays an important role in the ideas of the predictive processing. More specifically, the embodiment can define the sensory precisions, whereas the brain determines the prior precisions. For example, in their behavioral study, we observed the persisting behavior in children, which was generated as a result of the hyperplier in the network. But we could actually reproduce the similar behavior by modifying their sensory precisions. We know that the children have their lower precisions in their sensory signal. So in order to explain why some children have their persistent behavior, we could also should look at the sensory precision, how the sensory precision can be also gradually improved with age. And also we know from their children's behavior study that their immaturity of the sensory motor system plays an important role for learning. For example, the newborn babies have the very low acuity in vision, but it has been suggested that this low acuity helps children to extract more important signal in the visual input. And also the body size plays an important role to reduce their complexity on the environment. So we hope that by integrating their embodiment into the cognitive developmental studies, we can better understand how the brain can learn in more efficient way, and also how the predictive processing of the brain would work as observed in the human brain. I think that many of the studies, the computational studies looking at the predictive coding, often look only at the prior precision, but the sensory precision also plays an important role in the development. So we hope that we can address this issue as a very near future issue. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Yukie. This is a really interesting talk in line with all the many other talks yesterday.